It's time for Straight Talk Live with renowned radio pioneer Edna Howell Parrish, the television show and podcast dedicated to presenting thought-provoking issues and opinions with the goal of challenging listeners to re-examine their assumptions and expand their opinions and give thought to new ideas and concepts to better their lives and the lives of others. This is your opportunity to participate in making the world better. So without further ado, let's get ready for Straight Talk Live with your host Edna Howell Parrish.
Welcome everyone to our show today. This is Straight Talk Live, Issues and Opinions with Edna Howell Parrish. And we have a great show lined up for you today. And hopefully if you're listening, check in our chat and let us know that you're hearing us and that you're seeing us. We'd like to know, even if you're on Facebook or if you're on YouTube. YouTube is Edna. You ready? Issues and Opinions with Edna and Friends. That's on YouTube. And then Facebook is on my Facebook page, Edna Howell Parrish. So let us know in the chat this afternoon whether you're hearing us or seeing us, and give a thumbs up and let us know that you're with us. We appreciate that so very much. You know, our guest today is here to talk about a special topic that we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Issues and Opinions with Edna Parrish is so important because the election is coming up in November 2nd, in fact, the election day. We want to talk about this issue of elections and why it's so important and why people are not thinking critically. Why are you thinking with your gut feelings? Why are you thinking with emotions? We realize it is an emotional time of the year, but I think sometimes we think the way we think about elections because it's our nature. It's our way that we are self-serving. We want what we want when we want it. And so we think that we can get it by force. Like, would it be the ballot or the bullet? Why can't we think about history and how we got to where we are today and how we don't go back? Would you like that? I think you'd like to do that. That's what I think we would like to do as well. Our guest today is going to help us talk about that. Now, he comes to us from Michigan State University, Professor Dr. John H. McClendon III. He teaches the history of philosophy of race, and social and political philosophy at Michigan State University. Issues and Opinions with Edna and Friends. John McClendon is a friend. We go way back, all the way back to our elementary schoolyard. We have followed each other a long way. In fact, the ballot or the bullet has been with me for a long time. I think you loaned me a tape of the ballot and the bullet. I think you said your father was there and he heard Malcolm deliver that speech.
That's right.
I kept that tape for how many years? 25, 30 years before I finally returned it to you.
Yes, that's true.
You are very close to the issue of Malcolm X, especially with the whole issue of philosophy, the whole issue of Black history, and the whole issue of elections. Because when Malcolm X delivered that speech in 1964 in Cleveland, Ohio, I believe?
Yes.
He had a point that he wanted to make to America. The violence has to stop. The ballot can give us that calming effect. Maybe we can get somewhere we get the right ballot and get the people on the ballot and we can vote. Do you think that the ballot or the bullet today is very important for us to look back on and revisit it for history's sake?
No doubt, because I think for Malcolm X, the issue was centrally a question of how the denial of the ballot to African Americans have become a central point of discussion in terms of the United States and the question of civil and human rights. We can't overlook the fact that in 1964, there was something called Freedom Summer, where the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, commonly referred to as SNCC, went to Mississippi with the objective of organizing people to register to vote. And there was a violent terrorist response to the average African American, many of whom were sharecroppers and tenant farmers, who wanted to exercise the right to vote. And there was bloodshed, there was violence, there were bullets. And so Malcolm was making that assessment. If denied the ballot, then there was very little else but the bullet for African Americans in order for them to strive and gain their necessary civil and human rights. And so when he made that speech, it was in the context of the fight to build not only a movement to register voters, but significantly to create a political party in the very throes of racist Mississippi that would speak to the needs of African Americans. And that was called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was headed up by Ms. Fannie Lou Hamer, among others. And this became a very important political movement that challenged the very heart of U.S. politics and the Democratic Party, which on the one hand demonstrated, or at least called itself, the party in alliance with civil rights, but on the other hand was the party that represented segregation, the so-called Dixiecrats. And so what Malcolm did was to point this out, that this idea that Democrats were in alliance with African Americans was a fiction, because many of the most powerful Democrats were Dixiecrats, were white supremacists, were segregationists, who were in fact fighting against the idea that Black people should have the right to vote.
We're going to talk about this historically, but I want to talk about this for just a second, jump on the issue of Democrats and independents and Republicans. They think each of them are more prone to violence. So if we go way back to the beginning of our country and the Declaration of Independence, when people, they told us that we had the freedom of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so why back then, even after they began to have elections and we started having presidents, why are people shooting and having violence then? Because is that just part of human nature that we are violent?
I don't think it's just a matter of human nature. I think we have to look more specifically at the kind of society, social and political culture that frames the way in which people live from day to day. This country was born out of violence. You have to remember now that as Europeans advanced from Europe and came to North America, there were indigenous people who lived here. And the question remained, if one was going to occupy a land that was already occupied, then how would you do that? Well, the only way you can do so is by way of violence. And so from the very beginning then, this European expansionism was a violent expansion that ignored the humanity of indigenous people and their right to live on the land known as North America. Secondly, an integral part of this process was the slave trade. And we know that millions of Africans were taken from the continent of Africa, and we who are descendants of Africans recognize that that violence was an integral part of what it meant for African Americans to be in the United States and not on the west coast of Africa today. And so we cannot ignore that. It's something Karl Marx called the bloody dawn of the rise of capitalism, that this horrendous movement that assaulted indigenous people, that brought Africans over in slave ships, was a violent start to what became the United States. So we can't remove that. That's foundational. That's a part of the fabric of what this country is. And so as long as we ignore that under the guise that people of color are not human, then we can then not realize that when we see violence perpetrated against other white people in this country and then become shocked when a Trump is shot at, or when a John Kennedy is assassinated or a Robert Kennedy is assassinated, that kind of violence had already been deeply embedded in the life of this country.
This is the initial Straight Talk Live program. We've done this show for years, but we changed it a bit. We added issues and opinions with host Edna and friends. And friends we know for many years, my 45 years in broadcasting, I want to go back and I wanted to reach out to my friends to bring them in. Now, those of you that are watching this afternoon, we need to let others know what channel you're on. Now, if you're on YouTube, and that's Issues and Opinions with Edna and Friends, let us know in the chat. I see Maya McClendon is joining us this afternoon. So Maya, let us know what channel you're watching on so we can let others know as well. I see Big Homie Chris. That's my grandson, Christian Hal. That's his name, Big Homie Chris. If you're watching, let me know what channel that you're on. And then I see also Jordan McClendon. You know Jordan McClendon? These McClendons are in here big time. Maya says she's watching on YouTube. So for those that are watching and those that have access to a phone, let others know that they can go to YouTube now because we're live. And you can go to Issues and Opinions with Edna and Friends. Issues and Opinions with Edna and Friends. Thank you, Maya, for doing that. We really appreciate it. And then in the chat, if you have questions about the issue of the ballot or the bullet, if you have issues about why historically we need to know our history about voting and not think so much with our thoughts and feelings, put those comments in the chat. Let us know what you'd like to ask Professor McClendon or Dr. J or me about the show. We're just getting started, so it's a little difficult to get started, but we're going to do this nonetheless. Sometimes we have to take the rough road to get to our path, get back on the right path. So we had a little rough road today, but we're still nonetheless doing what we have to do to get this show on. Thank you for watching us this afternoon. Hello from Maya and Bobby. John?
Hello there.
It's so important, and we thank you both for joining us today, Maya and Bobby. And then I see Chris. Hopefully you're still there, Big Chris. Come on, Grandma needs to have you in there for that information. And Joyce, I know you're watching. Hopefully you're on as well. You can watch on YouTube as well. So go to YouTube, log in like you would, watch anybody else on YouTube. But in the browser, in the search, put in Issues and Opinions with Edna and Friends. That's it. Maya said she got it. Took a little while to get in there, but she got it, and we got back on the air today. So it is so important that you do that. Thank you all so much for joining us. The election is coming up in November. Okay, so people are thinking not critically, they're thinking emotionally. The Democrats and independents and Republicans are saying, well, Democrats are more prone to violence. And then they're saying, no, look what Donald Trump did last January 6th back in, what was it, 2021, the year 20? They took over the Capitol. That was violent, right? Americans are worried about their democracy and their right to vote. Will we lose that? It took so hard for a long time for us to get the right to vote, John. So can we lose it that quick if Donald Trump gets in?
Well, the thing is, the question that is presupposed is that it's here, that this is, in fact, a democracy.
Are we?
So, and that's what that presumption is false. So let's look at what that means when we think in terms of electoral politics in particular, because the idea behind it is that if you have the right to vote, then everyone who has that right is equal under the law. We call this juridical equality, being equal under the law. However, when we make an assessment that goes beyond the formal notion of being equal under the law and look at how the law operates with respect to the actual material conditions of people, then it becomes very clear. Let's take, for example, the fact that running a presidential campaign involves millions of dollars. In fact, one of the exciting points for a number of people is the fact that Harris has raised millions of dollars in just a few days. In fact, within 24 hours, she raised millions of dollars. And it's kind of ironic because the same kind of money cannot even be found for people who are homeless. In places like Los Angeles, where the great majority of people who live on the streets and are homeless, the great number of them are African American. What we're seeing today now is a movement that are taking away the meager shelter of homeless people who live on the street. So there's an actual sweep to take away the little tents and whatever people are able to afford in order to try to survive, as if they are criminals for being homeless. So why can't there be millions of dollars raised for the homeless, but millions of dollars are raised for presidential campaigns?
Well, there's white women for Kamala Harris. There's Black women. There's Black men. There's Hispanics. All these different people and groups are coming out for Kamala Harris, like you said, and raising that money. And you're right about why can't we do it? Or we can do it. But what is it that we lack? Leadership? What does it take somebody to have to get emotional over an election to be able to raise money to get what we need?
Well, I think the larger question is, and here's what we have to think about the systemic character of it. The system itself, the capitalist system, is about making profits. Political campaigns is about who is going to control the government, who's going to control the state, and then execute policies that serve in the interests of the most powerful. So when we think about that, then the interest of those who are powerless, despite maybe having the right to vote, but remain powerless because they have no wealth, then for those, the question of money, resources, day-to-day survival is always going to be precarious because capitalism is about making profits, not serving the interests of the great mass of working people, regardless of their racial and national identity. And so when we think about this, then the idea of raising millions of dollars for a political campaign is a part of the status quo of how the system operates. It's not designed for poor people to be a part of the political apparatus. It's designed from the very beginning, when the Constitutional Convention met, it was designed to preserve the interests of the most powerful and the most wealthy. And this is why the framers of the Constitution made it very clear that in each branch of the United States government, the legislative, judicial, and executive branches, that very little popular participation, very little by way of democratic participation would be allowed. And so that's why the highest office in the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, is not an elected position. And it has no term limits. Now imagine the President of the United States has term limits. You can no longer serve beyond 2 terms. But the Supreme Court has no term limits. Clarence Thomas has been there longer than several administrations in the executive branch. Who elected Clarence Thomas? Who decided that Clarence Thomas would make it possible for Donald Trump not to be prosecuted for his acts of criminal acts, and now as a felon, still be able to run for office when, in fact, in many states, you can go to prison if you are a ex-con who attempts to vote. Now let's think about that for a moment, because now we have this very important contradiction in talking about democracy. Where on the one hand, a person who is a felon, an ex-con, cannot vote, yet a wealthy billionaire like Donald Trump not only can vote, but can run for the presidency and then make a statement no more than just a couple of days ago where he says, you don't have to worry about voting once I'm elected again. What does that mean?
I heard that.
So we have to really realize, you see, that
Yeah.
the facade of democracy is what has to be challenged in terms of African American interest.
You're listening to Straight Talk Live, Issues and Opinions with Edna Parrish and friend, Professor John H. McClendon III, Michigan State University, a friend from way back. And we're talking about history and politics, or is it all about the emotions? Well, the framers of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, seems like they set up everything so that the politics could allow that electoral college, if need be, to pick who is going to be the president.
Yes, I mean, see, several things were put in place, and one of those was, of course, the Electoral College. So when we look at this, the Supreme Court is non-elected. The Senate, when it was initially established, the Senate was not a matter of direct electoral politics and participation on the part of the citizens of the United States. It took an amendment to the Constitution, and that wasn't until the 20th century that there would be direct elections for a Senate. The Senate was elected by various state legislatures who then determined who would be the two representatives from each state. Only the House of Representatives would be then directly elected. The presidency and the Electoral College becomes important because it then determines that who becomes president would not be in a decisive way determined by the popular vote. That's something that people like Alexander Hamilton and other Federalists wanted to have in place because they had deep concerns about popular political representation among the poor. Now, mind you, African Americans have been denied the ballot because the great majority were slaves. So it wasn't about denying African Americans the vote. It was denying the white working class the right to vote, and that only property wealthy people would have that possibility. And the course of U.S. history is that white poor people fought for what they thought would be a democratic society.
I was going to say wealthy white men got the vote.
That's right. That's right. And that was property qualifications became a very important part of who could vote and who could not vote. And so if you didn't own a certain amount of property, you didn't have a certain amount of wealth, and if you weren't male, you couldn't vote. And so the great majority of people in this country were excluded from the voting process, and then the voting process was restricted to certain parts of the government and not all parts of the government. So you can see then why I say the idea of democracy all along was a fiction.
I want to say this to people that are listening and those that will view this after it runs in today's program will run live. It'll run back later on. You can listen to it again. But there's people that are saying, well, I'm not going to vote. I'm going to sit this out because I don't like Donald Trump and I don't like Kamala Harris. Either one of them, I'm not going to vote. Well, do you see what they're wasting? Let's talk about history and how we even got to the point where African Americans or people of color could vote. Because first it was the rich white men that could vote first. Not even white women, but men. Talk about that, John. How far back does that go?
Yeah, well, it goes back when we look at the very beginning of the United States after the Constitutional Convention, as I mentioned, only a few people were allowed to vote, and then they can only vote on a few aspects of what would be then the government and the administration and rule of government. So we have a restricted body of people who have that right, and then you have a restricted region in which that would be a right that could be exercised. So you couldn't vote for the Supreme Court, you couldn't vote for the Senate, and the presidency would ultimately be determined by the Electoral College. Now, when the 13th Amendment was passed and abolished slavery, what followed that was a 14th Amendment, which established the citizenship of African Americans. There was a dilemma that right after the Emancipation Proclamation, there still remained the border states that had slavery. So the question became there had to be an amendment to end slavery. So the false notion that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves is something that we have to address, because Abraham Lincoln did not free slaves that were in the border states who did not join the Confederacy, but then, on the other hand, supported the Union. And that agreement, that compromise, was that the border states like Kentucky and Missouri could maintain slavery. So that necessitated a 13th Amendment. But then you can not be a slave, but that doesn't make an affirmative statement as to what one's political and legal position was. And so in some instances, former slaves were then taken back and forced to do labor, even though there had been a 13th Amendment. And the idea of citizenship then created something called due process and protection under the law. And so now citizenship affirmed the position of African Americans. And then the 15th Amendment granted the right to vote to African American males. Now, what happened as a result of that is that for a decade, from 1865 to 1875, there's something called Reconstruction, where Black people are now involved in electoral politics and holding offices at every level, federal, state, and local government. And that was seen as one of the most progressive periods in United States history, because not only did slavery end, but now you have Black males at least who are engaged in political activity and offices. But the overturn of Reconstruction made it very clear that the ballot was not strong enough to overcome the systemic character of a society that had determined that the masses of people would not have political power, because Black elected officials were able to sustain that position for a decade only because the Republican Party found being allies of Black people as a way of regaining their power over the former Confederacy. So it was a matter of convenience to have Black people voting, because Black people in mass who could vote voted for Republicans who represented the industrial capitalists. And once 1876 election arose, there was the problem of Rutherford B. Hayes losing the election to Samuel Tilden. And that election was determined on the basis of 3 Southern states, former Confederate states, having the electoral vote that would put Hayes into office, with a compromise of ending Reconstruction and the military occupation of certain segments of the South to protect Black people and their rights. So in effect, despite the vote, the ballot took over and terrorism became a way of life in terms of white supremacy in the South.
Even then, as we go through the years, what presidents were shot? What violence took place? And African Americans still couldn't vote, so it wasn't our fault.
Well, let's think about John Wilkes Booth and Abraham Lincoln. Let's think about what happened uh, over the course of the years, right up until the time when we, as young high school students, got notice that John Kennedy had been assassinated in November of 1963. I can remember very clearly sitting in the classroom at Dunbar High School and our speech teacher, Mrs. Jones, running into the room in tears because she had just attended the March on Washington in August of 63, and she was distraught when she heard that John Kennedy had been assassinated. Well, a number of Black people thought that John Kennedy was a friend of Black people, contrary to his real record, where he was not a very strong advocate for civil rights. He was a good political opportunist who understood that calling Coretta Scott King when Martin Luther King was in jail would galvanize Black votes, which it did. And it gave him the popular vote, and the Black vote was the margin of difference between John Kennedy becoming president of the United States. So he was playing the political game. But John and Robert Kennedy both were not very strong on supporting civil rights legislation. And so, as it were, Lyndon Johnson, who became president as a result of the assassination of John Kennedy, which, by the way, happened in Texas, and Johnson was a senator from Texas, he becomes president of the United States, and he takes more efforts at civil rights than John Kennedy. Now, mind you, when we go back to 1964 and Malcolm's Ballot or Bullet speech and what I said about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the real question became not just the right to vote, but organizing a political party in the interest of African Americans. That's a more fundamental challenge than just individuals voting, because now you're at the heart of the political battlefield when you have a political party not dependent upon the two dominant parties, Republicans and Democrats, who is organized to speak directly to the needs of African Americans. Lyndon Johnson saw that as a threat to the Democratic Party, and he moved immediately to wipe out this challenge that Miss Fannie Lou Hamer and others made. And they offered a compromise to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party by allowing them to have two representatives at the Democratic National Convention with no voting rights. Now, mind you, they were there, but they couldn't participate. And that's when Malcolm talks about sitting at the table and pretending as if you're a diner while you sit at an empty plate. That's what was offered to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So understand that when the Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965, they had effectively subverted the movement of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which represented the great mass of working Black people, sharecroppers, tenant farmers who lived in the very core of the most racist state in the United States, Mississippi, where people have been killed on a regular basis, that terror was a way of life. So Lyndon Johnson was not concerned with stopping that as he was in the Democratic Party winning the election. And he did. He won the election in 64. Later, he decided in 68 not to run because of the Vietnam War.
We're going to ask some questions of you when we come back from our break. We want to talk about going back to the rich white men getting their right. When did white women get the right to vote? When did Black men get the right to vote? And when did Black women get the right to vote? So it didn't happen all at once for African Americans. So stop and think about how emotional you can get and say, well, I'm going to sit this one out. No, you can't sit it out. You got to vote. And you got to think about who you're going to vote for. And you got to think about it not so much from an emotional point, because I don't like the vice president, Kamala Harris. I don't like her. You say, well, I don't like her. I don't know her. You want to get to know her, and you want to watch the speeches. I understand she was in Cincinnati this afternoon and got a rousing amount of support from them. But people aren't checking in with their money. They're not checking in with their mouths so much, but many people are. And even on Facebook, we see a lot of, not saying that you got to vote for African Americans only, but then you think about who you're going to vote for when you vote for former President Donald Trump and his running partner, J.D. Vance. We're going to take a break. We're going to take about 3 minutes in a break. And what you're going to see is a little bit of self-promotion, I call it, for me. Last year, I was inducted into the Dayton Broadcasters Hall of Fame, which is very nice. A lot of people knew it, some people didn't. So we want to let you see a little bit of this so you'll know who I am, what I'm coming from after 45 years in broadcasting. And I never left the microphone. I always wanted to find a way to get back on the air. And so I had someone working with me producing my show before. Didn't quite work out. So I had to get a program and learn how to do it myself. And so, like I said earlier, I'm flying solo. I'm being like the Wright brothers, trying to learn how to fly solo and do this. So we had little nips, little hiccups here, little hiccups there. We're on the air now. So we're going to run a little bit longer than what we thought we would be running. But we'll be back with our guest, Dr. John H. McClendon III from Michigan State University. He's my friend, and now he's yours. We'll be back after this.
Edna Howell Parrish, former radio personality and pioneer, began her radio career at WCXL-FM with her Jazz Kaleidoscope show in Dayton, Ohio. In 1977 and 1979, she began serving at WAVI-AM and WDAO-FM in several positions, including News and Public Affairs Director. Edna was also the editor of the Soul Sophisticator newspaper at WDAO from 1980 to 1986. In 1986, she became News and Public Affairs Director at WCIN-AM in Cincinnati, and then went on to anchor news for a short time at WSAI in Cincinnati. In 1989, Edna was named News Public Affairs Director at WIZF-FM and WDBZ 1230 AM, where she served for 12 years, and hosted a weekday show, Straight Talk Live, in Cincinnati on WIZF. After working for WAKW 93.3 FM, a Christian station in Cincinnati, Edna relocated to Atlanta for her husband's job and was hired as news anchor and public affairs director at V103 FM. Her next move was to Austin, Texas, where she anchored news and traffic for Metro Networks. Edna returned to the Dayton-Cincinnati tri-state after years away from Dayton, returning to care for several family members who were ill.
I've been able to connect with her because everything about her was everything I wanted to be. She has always been the consummate professional. In addition to that, very well respected and definitely not only an icon, but an image maker that I chose to pattern my career after. Watching Edna grow, she has been an amazing lighthouse in so many communities that she chose to work in. She reinvents herself and she tells a story, a great story, not just an African American story, but an American woman story in media. And I tell you, it's a great story.
Edna has covered heartbreaking news stories locally and major news stories such as the Democratic National Presidential Conventions, the Million Man March in Washington, D.C., and the Million Women March in Philadelphia. She helped raise thousands of dollars for scholarships, as well as created many programs to help in the rehabilitation of men and women in prison. In 2014, the Cincinnati Enquirer newspaper honored Edna in the prestigious gallery of the Next Best Top 40 radio personalities from the last 40 years on Cincinnati radio since 1973. In 1993, Edna was the recipient of the Great Rivers Girl Scout Council's Women of Distinction Award in Cincinnati. Edna Howell Parrish is truly a broadcast pioneer, and the Dayton Area Broadcasters Hall of Fame is pleased to welcome her into the class of 2022.
And you're back. Edna Howell Parrish, Issues and Opinions with Edna and my friend, Dr. John H. McClendon III. Well, John, so you learned a little bit more about me. A lot of people did too. But we thought that just give people a chance to know, well, why is she doing this? Why did she put herself through all this today? Because I had to. I had to, and I have to keep going. We're going to come back every week. We're going to do better on our timing. But when you're doing it all by yourself, it takes a lot more people than just you. And different ones are helping me with putting information and messages on Facebook. Apparently, we're on there, but they're not getting the video. So have some friends checking and letting everybody know to go to our page on YouTube where we're live now. So I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you, John, for working with me, helping us to get on the show today. We want to thank your grandson for helping. We want to thank everybody who pitched in to get us into this show today. It's really been a learning episode for all of us, hasn't it?
Sure. And it's struggle is always a collective process. I think it's important for us to recognize the collective nature of struggle. It's not the individual, but it's the collective viewpoint where we come together around our common interests, seeking a common solution. And so the collective unity that we develop and embrace becomes the real challenge of the future. You can always get rid of individuals, but you can never destroy a movement. And so what we have to be is to build a movement that will sustain generations to come. And what we want to do, I think, is to recognize your legacy. It's not just a matter, in my opinion, it is not a matter of self-promotion as it is a matter of understanding the legacy so that those who follow understand that this is what we call an intergenerational relay race. To pass on the baton, you have to be aware of where you are on the track and to be able to handle the handing over of the baton. You have demonstrated through the course of 45 years a relentless commitment to struggle. And what that means for our next generation is that they have, from your vision, the opportunity to build for the future. So I don't see it as self-promotion. I see it as self-clarification for the collective struggle.
And that's what I really appreciate you saying that. But although I may have given the 45 years God gave me, that a gift to be able to express myself and talk. And so I appreciate that. I didn't do it all by myself in 45 years. I want to thank a friend who is online now, my friend Holly Jenkins. We go way back. Holly posted on Facebook for me just now what was going on with us and where people can find us. We really appreciate that. She said, Mr. McClendon, you are right. We must celebrate your legacy, and I am for the movement. And so while we go back to the schoolyard, elementary schoolyard in Dayton, Ohio, and then we go back to the high school days at Dunbar High School in Dayton. And then all the projects that I have worked on for some reason, when I was editor and host at WGAO Radio in Dayton and publisher of the Soul Sophisticated newspaper, you ran a column there, you wrote a column for me in that. And so, like I said, years ago, even probably about 30 some years ago, you loaned me Malcolm X tape that your father recorded at the speech, the Ballot or the Bullet. I didn't give it back to you for about maybe 30 years later, but we go way back. I keep saying that, but I really do appreciate that. And then along comes, Jordan McClendon, along comes Maya McClendon, along comes different people that you know and that I know. And like Holly said, that's what friends are for. And so we appreciate that. And I don't want our friends to lose their ability to vote. When you say, I'm going to sit this one out. Let's go back to our history as we're talking this afternoon. learning about the opportunities that we have to at least vote and get the people into the office that we want. We don't really live in a democracy, but we have an opportunity to vote, John. And why is it so important? Let's go back. Rich white men first got the vote. White women really came after that. They wanted the vote too, right?
Yes, yes. There was a suffrage movement. Susan B. Anthony, among others. In fact, Frederick Douglass was a strong supporter of the suffrage movement. He was, in fact, involved in several of the conventions that were held in terms of women gaining the right to vote. So he was a vocal and steadfast ally for women gaining the vote. But let me say this. I think how we vote and when we vote is a matter of being critically engaged in recognizing what would work in our interest. I don't take the position that the vote, whether one votes or not, is the critical question. The question is, how does one understand what that means in a decisive moment in history? That's why Malcolm posted, the ballot or the bullet. Let's look at what those are and what that means. In my estimation, both the Democratic and Republican Party are working in terms of what they see as their interest. That's why I raised this question about the millions of dollars that's being raised around a presidential campaign, more than would ever be spent on helping poor working people, whether Black or not. And so you say, well, what are they then spending all this money for? What is this all about? And then why would then I vote in a situation whereby those resources are being galvanized? What are they being galvanized for? It's the questions that we have to raise, in my estimation at least, as to what serves our interest. And so therefore, what I see as the most valuable means in terms of presidential elections in particular is to educate people around what are the contradictions. Because what we do know is that in this particular presidential election, you have a very interesting situation. Kamala Harris has put more people in prison than Donald Trump. And he's a fascist. Make no mistake about it. He's a fascist and a racist. But Kamala Harris has put more people in prison than Donald Trump. Kamala Harris.
So that means that we should not vote for her, or that there is not some redeeming qualities in her that she could serve as president?
Well, that's why we look at it systematically. I mean, let's take the last time they had a Black president, Barack Obama. And what did he do? He made it very clear he did not have a Black agenda. He wanted Black people to vote for him. He wanted Black people to support him. But once he became president, he didn't have a Black agenda. So when we look at Kamala Harris, we have to look at her like any other politician. What did she do when she had an elective office? And we see that she was repressive. She, in fact, put forth the idea that Black parents, struggling working class Black parents, should be put in jail for children who were involved in skipping school. How repressive. That sounds like something Donald Trump would say.
But why did she do that? Kids were missing school, but why? I understand it was because they didn't have clothes to wear. She had washers and dryers put in the schools. So was that some redeeming quality?
But think about this. If you're the average Black parent, and let's say you are a single mother who have children to take care of, and one of your kids decides not to go to school, how does that resolve the problem of truancy by then incarcerating the mother, who then can no longer take care of any of her children. In other words, instead of blaming the victim, and this is a right-wing viewpoint, in my opinion, you don't blame the victim, you understand the systemic character of that situation. And so Kamala Harris didn't look at it that way. She took it as many of the so-called bootstrap people talk about. Well, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Yeah, but if you don't have any shoes, you can't pull yourself up. If you're in a situation where you need support, you don't repress parents who are faced with the dilemma of trying to raise families in the conditions of oppression and poverty. You give them more support. And so what I see from her vantage point was that she was thinking first as a prosecutor who wanted to put people in jail rather than a person who wanted to protect the rights of people who are struggling every day to provide for their families. And this has been the battleground, right, in terms of politics as to how do you look at this. So this goes back to a group of Democrats going all the way back to Bill Clinton, who initiated the program that says you cannot receive food support, what we call food stamps back in the day, and other social services if you did not work. Remember that? The work program that was initiated not by the Republicans, but by the Democrats. And so that was a repressive measure, as if people did not work because they didn't take the initiative. And we know that unemployment in this country is a consistent part of capitalism. So when we look at how the capitalist system works, people don't want to be poor. They don't desire to be unemployed. And what they get on welfare is surely not enough that would be a motivation where someone would say, I want to live on welfare all my life. It becomes the very last thread that gives people the opportunities to survive. That's all.
So we understand that. So alternative, don't vote for her because of what history told us about her repressive ideas back when she was in the California system as Attorney General and worked as a prosecutor. So we cross her off. So we don't work with her or go for Donald Trump because after all.
No, see, my argument is that it's not either or. What we have to develop, this is why I mentioned Ms. Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party.
Yes.
The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party didn't say, we either go with Lyndon Johnson or we go with the Republican Party. They said, let's form our own party and then forge a struggle around our own interests, to speak to our interests. We have to understand that the trick of the system itself is to get you to think that these are the only options and that you have a viable option with a Kamala Harris because she's a Black woman. When you look at her record is a record of any typical prosecutor that you will find. She put people in prison. In fact, there is one young man who does an excellent job, who lived in the Bay Area, and how her office put him in prison. He won a suit against them, in fact.
Right.
And he got, I think, some $7 million, where he was, and she relentlessly went against him, and not just, that wasn't an isolated case. Mm-hmm. So what are we talking about when we talk about Donald Trump as a fascist? What do fascists do? Well, one thing they do is to repress people, throw people in jail, and don't give them their due process. So how do we then say, well, Kamala is going to give you something different than Trump when we look at her record? What we have to do, and this is where the issue about critical examination rather than the emotional response. We have to critically examine what that is and what that means in today's world.
Yeah, but in today's world, but we have an election coming up in less than 100 days or so. So a third party too late to organize something like that? So what do? Do we sit this one out?
I think that's a question I think that needs to be debated and discussed within the Black community. See, my position is simply this. If we sit it out, we should critically have a discussion about what that participation should mean, and not simply jump on the bandwagon because this will be a quote Black woman / Asian woman / whatever that she is said to be. Her record does not tell us that there's going to be anything substantially progressive in terms of her politics. She is indicated by her own legacy where she stands both on domestic and foreign policy. She is a solid supporter, even though she disagrees with Netanyahu and what he's doing. The fact is that she is a solid supporter of Zionism. So we know that. We know where she stands on that. We know that she has been a part of the group of African American politicians, which includes Hakeem Jeffries, in trying to force African countries to follow U.S. policy. We know that. And they rejected her and told her to go back to the United States. We know then that her viewpoint is not a progressive viewpoint in terms of the African community. So this is the same position we were in when Clarence Thomas went through the hearings for his position that he still holds today on the Supreme Court. The same question you are raising to me were being raised when they said, well, what do we do? Should we support this Black man because now that Thurgood Marshall will no longer have the seat, we will lose this seat and we won't have another Black person on the Supreme Court? Should we support Clarence Thomas? And quite frankly, the majority of Black so-called leadership came out in his support. HBCU college presidents came out and supported him. The civil rights leaders of the day came out and supported him. Fraternities and sororities. Can't you see that? See that how closely in line that is with Kamala Harris?
I see how.
And look what Clarence Thomas has done. So this is why I'm saying it becomes an important discussion and debate. It's not like we're going to waste something if we do not support her. It's just like we wouldn't have lost anything if we had not supported Clarence Thomas. In fact, we've lost quite a bit because there was that support for Clarence Thomas, because Clarence Thomas is what? He's gone his own way.
Yes,
and allowed Donald Trump now as a felon to run as president and not even face the consequences for his actions. So that's why we have to discuss that. We have to have those kind of debates and deliberations rather than presume that if she is not in office, that somehow we will be worse off if she wasn't. We can't make that presumption.
So a third party. What about other people running for office? Who would you get? Who would be able to have that power to get people to pull in and to vote for them or vote for the issues that we want?
Well, that's why I talk in terms of the question of an independent party. You see, the way the deck is stacked with the two-party system as it is today, both of those parties represent the powerful, the wealthy, the 1% that we talk about. That's who they represent. They represent different segments because the ruling class is not monolithic. They have objective interests that they share, but they have different policies that they want to execute in terms of different interest groups. So this is why you can find one person at one point saying, I will finance Trump, and another point said, well, I'm going to give my money to Harris. You may know this billionaire who recently changed his mind after being a Trump financier, saying now he's going to give money to Harris. But that's a billionaire. That's what billionaires do. They buy politicians that bid their doings. This is what lobbying groups become important. They're more significant in terms of what happens in policy than our vote. We go out thinking our vote is going to be the determining factor, but what really are the real bigwigs behind it all are lobbying groups who then push their interests, because what do? They finance the campaigns
I was
that
going to
take
say,
place.
the money is the power and not our voice.
Say that again, please.
The money becomes the power and not our voice.
Precisely.
Voices are not being recognized by the candidates that are running for office. So in the middle of the stream, we can't turn that horse around. Ms. Harris is who she is.
That's right. And that's why so many people were so disappointed in Barack Obama, because at least Barack Obama, unlike Kamala Harris, had some, community organizing credentials, credibility, as, in Chicago, and certain people saw that, he was quasi-progressive until the split with Jeremiah Wright, and then he became exposed for what he was.
Right.
But what we know is that we have to begin to rethink what it means to be political and what it means to uphold the interests of the African American community. And it surely, in my opinion, is not a matter of choosing between Democrats and Republicans. I think that's what Malcolm was trying to convey in his Ballot or Bullet speech. Don't get caught up in saying, well, this one's a liberal and this one's a conservative. He talked about one being a fox and the other one being a wolf. They both belong to the dog family. We have to understand that. And so what we have to do is begin to build from the bottom up rather than the top down. What we have to understand is that our long-term interests are fundamentally based upon recruiting, developing, having an assessment of our needs and interests, making that very clear, and then supporting political action by various means, not just at presidential elections, because I really think many instances the struggles are at the local and state level, where in fact we can have control over certain institutions through an organized effort, which then you build ground up, because the larger question is a class question, right? How poor people are faced with that. So we no longer have to look at the fact that Black men today who are in the state of Louisiana and Angola, Louisiana, are actually being held as slaves, working in heat that is life-threatening, and chained and shackled as if 1865 never happened. That's happening today.
Sit me on that, yeah. So, but John, I think before we go, I just want to make sure that people are understanding. It's not that we're talking against people voting or saying that you shouldn't vote this time, but think about who you're going to vote for. What are the interests that you have as a father with grandchildren? What would be your interest for a politician or Ms. Harris or Mr. Trump to look out for you?
Yeah, see, I don't expect Harris or Trump to look out for those interests. That's not my expectation. It's kind of like looking at two slaveholders. One's the liberal and the other's the guy that's supposed to be the bad slaveholder.
Okay.
He's the good master and the bad master. They're both slaveholders. So once you understand that there's this fundamental question that they're both slaveholders, so their interests lie on maintaining my oppression, then what I have to think about is what Frederick Douglass talked about, that freedom comes through the self-determination of those who are enslaved. You don't look to those people to free us. Okay. What we do, we may have tactical approaches to the question of electoral politics. We may support one candidate versus another candidate, and then say we approach this as a tactical question. This is where we have to become more politically sophisticated. That's where the emotion goes out the window, and we begin to understand that. And if those politicians have something in mind which is not in our interest, we don't support that. It's quite clear, for example, if we look at the question of what it means to think in terms of, let's take the recent Black Lives Matter movement and talking about state terrorism and the police. and we look at Kamala Harris's record as a prosecutor, when we know she's not on that board. And this is why a recent professor in San Francisco did a systematic analysis about how she stood in all those questions, because she didn't come off as a progressive around police reform. She came off as a prosecutor who was looking upon poor Black people as criminals, the same way that Biden looked upon them when he passed the crime bill that put thousands of people into prison. So, but they were Democrats. So now we have to say, okay, so how do we look at this? Now we got to say, look, you're not going to have Black people merely jumping on your board unless we see such and such in your program, in your platform. You have to challenge them the same way other groups who exercise their political interests.
So if your interest is in crime, policing, taking away the guns, we're not, Kamala's not in our interest in that, because you know where she would be, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. See, my interest would be telling her, look, we have a major problem of Black people being assaulted by the police.
Right.
What's your position on this question? How do you look upon your presidency in regard to what's happening? So here they're going to be in Chicago in just a few days, meeting a few miles from where this woman was shot, blatantly shot and killed, blown away, shot in the face. What is your position with respect to that? She has never spoken out on these issues.
All right.
She's never spoken on those.
What if my issues were about, just say, reproductive rights, abortion, having the right to control my own body? Now, there are people that believe that's a big one for them. So if we said, she speaks out on that, so that would be something that they would like. Gender identity.
Yeah, you see, when you look at those questions, and again, there's a lot of progressive stuff around that, right? Because we know that the Supreme Court overturning the Roe versus Wade was a reactionary turn, and that they have stacked the Supreme Court. Again, that's systemic, right? What we were talking about before. People don't vote for the Supreme Court. That's a part of the way the system operates. Now, she has come out in terms of women's rights, reproductive rights. That's a progressive stance. For some, at least, and some people in the African-American community, they have a more fundamentalist viewpoint in terms of religion, so they don't see that as progressive. I personally see it as a progressive position. But she also knows that appeals to a wider audience than just Black women, because there are a number of white women and working class women who see that as a draconian measure on the part of the Supreme Court ruling. Right. And so therefore she can win a lot of votes there. So that is where she's looking at that. What we have to say, and what she is taking for granted, is that she's going to have a substantial Black voting bloc because she is Black. She's going to have that. And what we have to be, and this is why I'm saying about the notion of having those kinds of deliberations, we have to begin to say, oh no, you just can't take that for granted. That, that Black people are going to come, because that's what Barack Obama did, and he never came up with an agenda for Black people. He talked about a post-racial society, that racism was basically all gone, and that what are you crying about? And told all the civil rights leaders that basically just hold your horses. I'm doing what I got to do because I'm not the president of Black people. I'm the president of this whole country, as if Black people were not in this country. You see, and so then you have a situation whereby after 8 years of Barack Obama, he never once developed any kind of systematic program. And what was interesting about this is that there were Black scholars who developed projects around certain economic reforms that Obama would not even take a look at. One of the leading Black economists who's teaching today at Duke University, who has done a lot of work on this idea of Black compensation and economic reform, and he never once looked at his work. That's what we have to challenge Harris with. Are you going to take up those kind of questions? Believe me, Trump understands Heritage Foundation and why Project 2025 is consistent with where he wants to go.
And that's where we'll go next week. We'll talk about Project 25. Before we go today, I know we cannot solve the problems in one show. That's why we're going to do several shows on this as election comes around. Have other people on with their opinions and their thoughts as well. But I want us to stop and talk about as we think critically. And we're lazy. Our brains are lazy. We don't want to think critically. We want to go with our gut feelings. Our gut feelings tells us to vote because of color. Vote because she's a woman. Vote because she's a Democrat. Vote against Trump because he's a Republican. Vote against him because he is a convicted criminal. Vote against him because we just don't like him. We don't like J.D. Vance either. So we're going to be continuing to break this down and stop being lazy. Stop learning how to just not do the work. We have to do the work. And I appreciate you telling us that and to helping us get to this point that we have to get to, John. I really do. Next week, as we said, we're going to talk about issue Project 2025. Trump said at first he didn't know anything about that, but he helped to write it. But then again, everybody has to think in their own way. You also have an article that you wrote. It's called 2016 Election, the Capitalist State and the Political Economy of Democracy. That's something that people can get and read and understand historically where we got to today. Tell people a little bit about that, and we'll let them know how they can get a copy of that if they'd like.
Sure. That's a piece that it was actually an address, a keynote address that I gave at Fresno State University as a part of the African American Intellectual Thought Symposium. And it was reflections on the recent election of Donald Trump in 2016 and what it meant for us to think about the whole principle around presidential elections. And so I use this analogy called the rain dance and how deeply rooted it is in terms of the thinking of people that presidential elections are decisive to the way in which this country operates. I wanted to show that if you don't understand the larger picture and think critically and develop in a framework, and I talk about that critical framework in terms of 3 levels of critique: empirical critique, which are critiques over matters of fact; conceptual critique, which is a critique at the level of ideas where people develop concepts and notions about things. For example, the concept that this country is a multiracial nation. And we challenge that notion that this is and always been a multiracial nation. We argue that this is a multinational state and it's never been one nation. So when we look at indigenous people in themselves not only are a nation, but are made up of several nations. So then how can you call the United States one nation and then understand that conceptually? And so part of what we do at that level is offer a conceptual critique. And then lastly, in this piece, we talk about ideological critique, and that's the critique at the level of worldview. And so a worldview critique is a fundamental reconception of how we see the reality before us. And that's why sometimes it's difficult because the worldview that comes to shape how the United States presents itself and its history is many times challenged not at the level of worldview, but only in terms of refining the narrative. That is to say, rather than offer a fundamental, rudimentary assessment, we just want to put a black face in the story and think that that solves the problem. That is, put a black face in the White House and that'll solve the problem. Put a black face in the history so that now you begin to say, I too sing America, the title of the poem by Langston Hughes. When in fact, I go with Malcolm. We're not Americans, we're victims of Americanism. And so what we have to understand then is these fundamental differences come into play as we look at our interests. So this piece is available. Anyone who has an interest or wants to get a copy of that, if you contact me at my email address, dr.j@att.net, I will be happy to send you a copy of that. It's a part of a newsletter called the American Philosophical Association Newsletter on Philosophy and the Black Experience. And I wrote that, and I was very fortunate that the speech that I gave was transcribed by my dear colleague, friend, and comrade, Dr. Stephen C. Ferguson, who diligently went through the speech and transcribed it. So I want to thank Dr. Ferguson here for his contribution in making that available.
Wonderful. Well, as we go along with the show, I want you to write me, Edna Howell Parrish, to let me know who you would like to see on the show, what some of the topics are that you would like for us to discuss. We'll talk about, of course, politics as we get closer to the election. We'll continue to talk about that. So if you're interested, please let me know. And then I can also get back with you. Email me. There's my email address. I just had John's on the screen for you as well. But email me and let me know who you want to have on the show, who you think would be interesting. If you really are set on voting for who you're going to vote for, that's okay. We want to talk about that. We're going to talk about that some more, because this is not the be-all end of the show. If y'all been with me, you've been riding with me for a while, you know that we have all kinds of opinions and we talk about everything on the show. So perhaps, as we said when we started out the show, it's probably our nature, our thinking, our own self-interest, our thoughts, our support, our laziness that lead us to vote for who we want to vote for. It's in our own self-interest. So think about that as we continue to talk about these issues up with the upcoming election. I like the idea, John. You're making us think. I want to be lazy. I know I am. And, but I'm not. I'm open. I'm a thinker. And my thought process says to think this through. That's what I want to do, think this through. Thank you so much for joining us at Michigan State University. Your students that you have in class, I know they get a big kick out of being with you, don't they?
Oh, yes. We have a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. Well, school will be getting ready to start for you guys soon, so I know you got a lot you have to give back to your family, and you're going to give us a few weeks on the show, so we thank you so much for that and for joining us for today on the show.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure, and I look forward to next week.
Excellent. I'll be looking forward to seeing you on the show as well, John. And any parting comments that you would like to leave with our listeners and viewers?
I just want to say it's been my pleasure. I'm very excited and happy to see that you're back and you have so much to offer. So we're excited about that. And we need to get people involved. And so the more people you can tell them about this very important show, this very important broadcast, this very important discussion, the better. We want more and more people engaged. What we need to do more of is to have deliberation and discussion. We come from a culture, I know, where many of us rather shout as a response to whatever we hear. And that has its place. But deliberation and discussion is what's going to take us in the long term. And that's what's going to prepare us for the future ahead. We need more people who take the long race than the sprint. It's okay to be fast in 100 meters, but when you can run that long race, then we know we have a chance to win the protracted struggle that face us in the future.
Well, the Ballot or the Bullet got on the air today. We appreciate you, John, for being here. The Ballot or the Bullet. Why can't we learn to think critically? And that's what we're hoping we got everybody on the right track for doing that. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Edna Howell Parrish, your host for today's show.
Thanks for tuning in to Straight Talk Live with renowned radio pioneer Edna Howell Parrish, the program dedicated to presenting thought-provoking issues and opinions with the goal of challenging listeners to re-examine their assumptions and expand their opinions and give thought to new ideas and concepts to better their lives and the lives of others. Join us next week for another opportunity to participate in making the world better. So until next week, live your best life from your friends at Straight Talk Live and host Edna Howell Parrish.
Hey, it turned out well.
Can she hear you? Can she hear you?